The dust swirled around Adeline Davis's feet as she stumbled down from the wagon, the heavy iron shackles on her wrists clanking with each movement. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the small town of Florissant, Colorado, as she squinted through the haze, her parched lips cracked and bleeding from the 3-day journey. It was 1875, and the promise of a new life out west had turned into a nightmare of indentured servitude. "Get moving, girl," barked the man who'd purchased her contract. Herbert Wilcox, a portly businessman with yellowing teeth and breath that reeked of whiskey, yanked the chain connecting her wrists. "I paid good money for 7 years of your service, and we're already behind schedule." Adeline stumbled forward, her once fine dress now tattered and filthy. At 22, she had fled an arranged marriage in Boston only to be tricked by an employment agency that had sold her into what amounted to slavery. The legal papers Wilcox carried meant nothing to her. She'd signed them under false pretenses, believing she would be a paid schoolteacher. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "There's been a mistake. I'm a free woman." Wilcox laughed, a harsh sound that caught the attention of several townsfolk on Florissant's Main Street. "Not anymore. The contract says otherwise." As he dragged her toward his mercantile store, Adeline caught sight of a tall figure leaning against a hitching post. The man straightened, his eyes narrowing as they fell on her chains. Even from a distance, she could see the hard lines of his face soften into something like anger, not at her, but at the sight before him. Ethan Fairfield had seen many things in his 30 years: the horrors of the Civil War, the brutality of life on the frontier, and the casual cruelty humans could inflict upon one another. But the sight of a woman in chains on Florissant's Main Street made his blood boil. He pushed away from the post where his chestnut mare was tied, his spurs jingling as he stepped into the street. "Wilcox," he called, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who rarely needed to shout to be heard. "What in God's name are you doing?" Herbert Wilcox paused, tugging Adeline to a stop beside him. "This doesn't concern you, Fairfield. Just taking delivery of my new help." Ethan's gaze met Adeline's, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared humanity that made her heart skip. His eyes were the color of a summer storm, gray-blue and intense beneath the brim of his worn leather hat. "Last I checked," Ethan said, stepping closer, "the war ended a decade ago, slavery with it." "This ain't slavery," Wilcox protested, waving a folded paper. "It's a legal labor contract. 7 years of service to pay for her passage and training. Common practice back east. Those chains say otherwise." Ethan's hand rested casually on the revolver at his hip. It wasn't a threat, not yet, but a reminder that justice in the West sometimes came from sources other than courts. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Florissant wasn't large, barely 500 souls, but it had grown enough in recent years to support a sheriff who now pushed his way through the onlookers. "What's the trouble here?" Sheriff Davis asked, his weathered face frowning at the sight of Adeline's chains. Before Wilcox could answer, Ethan spoke. "This man's got a woman in chains, claiming she's under contract." The sheriff looked at Adeline, his eyes lingering on the iron shackles. "That true, miss?" "I signed papers to be a schoolteacher," Adeline said, her voice stronger now that someone seemed willing to listen. "I didn't agree to this." She raised her chained wrists. "Got the contract right here," Wilcox said, unfolding the document. "All legal and proper." Sheriff Davis took the paper, reading it slowly, his frown deepening. "This does appear legal on its face, but—" he glanced at Adeline's chains. "We don't hold with keeping folks in irons around here, Wilcox, contract or no." "My property, my rules," Wilcox insisted. "She tried to run in Denver." Ethan stepped forward. "How much All eyes turned to him. "What?" Wilcox asked. "How much for her contract?" Ethan clarified, his voice steady. Wilcox laughed. "She's not for sale. Cost me $300 to bring her out here. Need someone to run the store while I handle my other businesses." Ethan reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded wad of bills. 500. Cash, the crowd murmured. It was a small fortune in a place where a good monthly wage was $30. Adeline stared at the stranger, unable to comprehend why he would offer such a sum. Was he just another man looking to own her? Her heart sank at the thought, Wilcox's greedy eyes fixed on the money. "Well now, that's different, but she's worth at least 700 to me." 600, Ethan countered, "and not a penny more." After a moment of calculation, Wilcox nodded. "Done." The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "Fairfield, you sure about this?" "Never been more sure," Ethan replied, counting out the bills and handing them to Wilcox. "Now the key to those shackles." Wilcox produced a small iron key from his pocket and handed it over along with the contract. The moment the transaction was complete, Ethan turned to Adeline. "May I?" he asked, holding up the key. Stunned, Adeline extended her wrists, hardly daring to hope. The crowd watched in silence as Ethan gently inserted the key into the first lock. The mechanism clicked, and the manacle fell open, revealing a band of raw, chafed skin. He did the same with the second one, his touch careful as he removed the iron bands. The chains fell to the dusty street with a thud that seemed to echo through Adeline's very soul. She rubbed her wrists, staring at the man who had just paid a small fortune for. "What? Her servitude? What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan held out the contract to her. "That's for you to decide." Adeline stared at the paper, not comprehending. "This piece of paper doesn't make you anyone's property," Ethan said, his voice carrying to the onlookers. "Not his, not mine. Where I come from, a person's worth isn't measured by contracts or coins." With trembling fingers, Adeline took the document. "I don't understand." "You're free," Ethan said simply. "As free as anyone else in this town, as free as me. But you paid. Consider it an investment in making things right." Ethan's mouth curved into a slight smile. "Besides, Florissant could use a schoolteacher. The children here are growing up wild as weeds." A woman in the crowd stepped forward. "We've been trying to hire a teacher for months. The children need proper schooling." Adeline looked around at the faces watching her, not with the judgment or disdain she'd feared, but with curiosity and even hope. I am qualified. I taught in Boston for 2 years." "Then it's settled," the sheriff said. "Martha Jenkins has a spare room she rents. You can stay there until you get your bearings." He glanced at Ethan. "Unless you had other arrangements in mind, Fairfield." "No," Ethan said quickly. "Miss Davis should have her own place, her own life." He tipped his hat to Adeline. "Madam, welcome to Florissant. You'll find we're not all like Wilcox here." As the crowd began to disperse, with Martha Jenkins coming forward to introduce herself, Adeline caught Ethan's arm. "Why did you do it?" she asked. His eyes met hers, and there was something in them, a memory, perhaps, or an old wound. "Because every person deserves to be treated as an equal," he said. "And because chains don't belong on anyone, least of all someone just looking for a fresh start." With that, he tipped his hat again and turned to go. "Wait," Adeline called. "I don't even know your name." He glanced back over his shoulder. "Ethan Fairfield. I've got a ranch about 5 miles north of town." A smile touched his lips. "I imagine we'll be seeing each other around, Miss Davis." As she watched him walk away, Adeline felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. And something else, something unexpected that fluttered in her chest when their eyes had met. But she quickly tamped it down. She was in no position to indulge such feelings, not when her life was in such disarray. First, she needed to establish herself, to prove she was more than a woman who needed rescuing. Only then could she face Ethan Fairfield as a true equal. The Jenkins boarding house turned out to be a tidy two-story building near the church, with a small garden out back that reminded Adeline of home. Martha Jenkins was a widow in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "The room's small but clean," Martha said as she showed Adeline upstairs. "Bathrooms down the hall. Meals are at 7, noon, and 6. No gentlemen callers in the rooms, and I expect quiet after 9. Adeline nodded, surveying the simple furnishings: a narrow bed, a washstand, a small writing desk, and a wardrobe. "It's perfect, thank you." "Now," Martha said, her eyes taking in Adeline's disheveled appearance, "let's get you a bath and some clean clothes. Can't have our new schoolteacher looking like she's been dragged behind a stagecoach." 2 hours later, bathed and dressed in a borrowed dress that was a bit too large but blessedly clean, Adeline sat at Martha's kitchen table with a bowl of hearty stew before her. Her hair was still damp, but she felt human again for the first time in weeks. "So you're from Boston?" Martha asked, setting a slice of fresh bread beside Adeline's bowl. "Yes," Adeline replied, then hesitated. How much should she reveal? "My parents died of influenza 2 years ago. I was teaching at a small private academy when—" She trailed off, unsure how to explain the series of unfortunate events that had led her here. "When you decided to come west," Martha supplied gently. Adeline nodded, grateful for the woman's discretion. "Something like that." "Well, you're not the first to seek a new beginning out here, and you won't be the last." Martha sat across from her. "The town council meets tomorrow evening. I've already sent word that you're here. They'll want to meet you before making any formal teaching arrangements." "Thank you," Adeline said, suddenly overwhelmed by the woman's kindness. "I don't know how I'll repay you for all this." Martha waved away her concern. "You can start by eating that stew before it gets cold. You're thin as a rail." As Adeline ate, she found her thoughts drifting to Ethan Fairfield. The way he had stood up to Wilcox, the gentle way he'd removed her chains, the respect in his voice when he'd called her his equal. She'd never met a man like him. "Tell me about Mr. Fairfield," she said, trying to sound casual. Martha's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Ethan, he's a good man. Came here after the war, bought land nobody thought was worth much, and turned it into one of the most successful cattle operations in the county. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's always the first to help when someone's in trouble." "He's not married?" Adeline asked before she could stop herself. "No," Martha replied. "There was a girl once, I heard, back east during the war. Don't know what happened, but he's never shown interest in any of the local ladies, despite plenty trying." She gave Adeline a pointed look. "He made quite an impression on you, I take it." Adeline felt her cheeks warm. "He was kind when he didn't have to be, that's all." Martha said, clearly unconvinced. "Well, you'll have plenty of time to get to know folks here. Florissant's small enough that everybody knows everybody's business, but large enough that you can carve out your own place." That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed, Adeline found sleep elusive. Her wrist still bore the red marks of the shackles, a reminder of how close she'd come to a life of servitude. And yet, by some miracle, or rather, by the intervention of a stranger with storm-gray eyes, she was free. Free to build a new life, free to be herself, free to decide her own fate. With that comforting thought, she finally drifted off to sleep, unaware that 5 miles away, Ethan Fairfield was lying awake as well, thinking of a brave woman with defiant eyes who had stirred something in him he'd thought long dead. The town council meeting was held in the back room of Florissant's only hotel, a gathering of 5 men who collectively made decisions affecting the town's development and governance. Adeline, dressed in a simple blue dress borrowed from Martha's niece, waited nervously outside while they discussed her potential appointment. When she was finally called in, she found herself facing a semicircle of serious faces: the mayor, a shopkeeper, the bank manager, a rancher, and surprisingly, the sheriff. No Ethan Fairfield, she noted with a mixture of relief and disappointment. "Miss Davis," Mayor Thompson began, "we understand you're interested in the teaching position." "Yes, sir," Adeline replied, standing straight. "I have 2 years' experience teaching in Boston, and I'm certified in all common subjects." "And how did you come to be in Wilcox's?" "Employment," the bank manager asked, his tone carefully neutral. Adeline took a deep breath. "I answered an advertisement for teachers needed in the West. The agency in Boston arranged my passage, but when I arrived in Denver, I discovered they had sold my contract to Mr. Wilcox. When I protested, She gestured to her wrists, where the marks were still visible. "They restrained me." The men exchanged glances. "This sort of contract labor is becoming unfortunately common," Sheriff Davis said. "People desperate for a new start sign papers they don't fully understand. It's legal, technically, but it borders on involuntary servitude." "Well, that's behind you now," Mayor Thompson said firmly. "The question is whether you're prepared to take on our school. We have 28 children, ages 6 to 16, with varying levels of education. The schoolhouse is small, supplies limited." "I've taught in worse conditions," Adeline assured him. "If you'll give me the chance, I promise to provide the best education possible for your children." After a few more questions about her teaching methods and expectations, the council conferred briefly and then turned back to her. "The position pays $30 a month with room and board provided above the schoolhouse," Mayor Thompson said. "There's no formal term. We'll assess how things are going after the first 3 months. Is that acceptable?" Adeline could hardly believe it. Just days ago, she'd been in chains, facing years of unpaid servitude. Now she was being offered a respectable position with fair compensation. "Yes, that's more than acceptable. Thank you." "Excellent. School is currently on summer break, but we'd like you to start in 2 weeks, giving you time to prepare the schoolhouse and develop your lessons." The mayor stood and extended his hand. "Welcome to Florissant, Miss Davis." As Adeline left the hotel, a wave of elation washed over her. She had secured a position on her own merits, not because of Ethan's intervention. The thought gave her a sense of pride that had been missing for too long. Speaking of Ethan. As if summoned by her thoughts, she spotted him across the street, loading supplies into a wagon. Without giving herself time to reconsider, she crossed to him, dodging a passing horse and rider. "Mr. Fairfield," she called. He turned, and for a moment, his normally guarded expression brightened. "Miss Davis, you're looking well." Indeed, she was a far cry from the bedraggled woman in chains he'd encountered 2 days earlier. "Thank you. I wanted to tell you that I've been appointed as the town's new teacher." "Congratulations," he said, genuinely pleased. "The children here need someone who cares about their education." "I also wanted to thank you again," Adeline said, suddenly finding it difficult to meet his gaze. "And to tell you that I intend to repay you." Ethan frowned. "That's not necessary." "It is to me," she insisted. "I can't offer $600 all at once, but I can pay you back over time." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "If it's important to you, I won't refuse, but there's no hurry." He hesitated, then added, "Actually, I could use some help. Not as repayment, but as a job, if you're interested." "What kind of help?" "My foreman's wife just had a baby, and they're struggling to keep up with their 3 older children. I was thinking they could use some tutoring before school starts." He gestured to his wagon. "I'm heading back to the ranch now. You'd be welcome to come see the place, meet the family. Adeline hesitated. It would be improper to go alone to a man's ranch, especially a man she barely knew. And yet, she wanted to see where he lived, to understand more about the person who had freed her without a second thought. Martha wouldn't approve of me going unchaperoned, she said finally. Ethan's lips curved into a smile. Mrs. Patterson, my foreman's wife, would be there the whole time. And I'd have you back by supper. Adeline found herself returning his smile. In that case, I accept. Let me just tell Martha where I'm going. 15 minutes later, they were headed north out of town, the wagon rolling along a well-worn track that wound through pine-covered hills. Adeline sat beside Ethan on the bench seat, acutely aware of his presence, the breadth of his shoulders, the strength in his hands as he handled the reins, the clean scent of soap and leather that surrounded him. "How did you end up in Florissant?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Ethan glanced at her, then back at the road. "After the war, I couldn't go back to Virginia. Too many ghosts. I drifted west, worked as a ranch hand in Kansas, then Nebraska. Finally saved enough to buy my own place. This land called to me, something about the mountains, the forests. You fought for the Union," Adeline guessed. His hands tightened briefly on the reins. "Yes, joined up in '61, right after Fort Sumter. Spent 4 years watching good men die for a cause that should never have needed fighting for in the first place." The bitterness in his voice told her more about his feelings on slavery than any declaration could have. "Is that why you stepped in when you saw me? Because of the chains?" Ethan was quiet for so long that Adeline thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "Partly, but mostly because it was wrong, simple as that." He looked at her fully now, the wagon slowing as he did. "No person should own another, ever." The intensity in his gaze made Adeline's heart beat faster. "I agree," she said softly, "and I'm grateful every day that you were there." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither was ready to name. Then Ethan turned his attention back to the road, and they continued on in silence until they crested a hill, and the Fairfield ranch came into view. It was larger than Adeline had expected, a substantial main house built of sturdy logs, several outbuildings, corrals holding horses and cattle, and beyond, rolling pastures bordered by forest. Men were working with the livestock, and smoke rose from the chimney of what appeared to be a bunkhouse. "It's beautiful," Adeline said truthfully. "It's home," Ethan replied, a note of pride in his voice. "Took 4 years to build it up to what you see now. Started with just me, a dozen cattle, and a dream." He guided the wagon to the main house, where a woman stood on the porch, a baby in her arms and 3 children playing in the yard. The oldest, a boy of about 12, ran to take the horse's reins as Ethan helped Adeline down from the wagon. "Miss Davis, this is Alice Patterson, my foreman's wife," Ethan said, introducing the woman on the porch. "Alice, this is Miss Adeline Davis, Florissant's new schoolteacher." "Welcome," Alice said warmly, shifting the baby to extend her hand. "We've been hoping the town would find a teacher. My Robert's getting too clever for his own good without proper schooling." The boy who'd taken the reins grinned. "Ma exaggerates. I ain't that clever." "I'm not that clever," Adeline corrected automatically, then smiled to soften the correction. "And I suspect your mother knows exactly how clever you are." Robert looked at her with new interest. "You really going to be our teacher?" "I am," Adeline confirmed. "School starts in 2 weeks." "Mr. Fairfield says you might help us before then," said a girl of about 10 who had approached with her younger brother in tow. "If your parents agree, yes," Adeline replied, looking to Alice for confirmation. "We'd be grateful," Alice said. "James has been away working cattle drives so much, and with the new baby." She looked down at the infant in her arms. Time for learning has been in short supply. Why don't you all get acquainted, Ethan suggested, while I help James finish with the new calves. Miss Davis, feel free to use the house if you need a quiet place to work with the children. As he strode away toward the corrals, Adeline found herself watching him go, admiring the confident way he moved. When she turned back, she caught Alice watching her with knowing eyes. "He's a good man," Alice said quietly while the children gathered their books from inside. "The best I've known beside my James." "He saved me," Adeline admitted. "In more ways than one." Alice nodded. "He told James what happened, said it made his blood boil to see you in chains." She studied Adeline. "You've made quite an impression on him, you know. He doesn't usually take to strangers." Before Adeline could respond, the children returned with their books, and the conversation shifted to their studies. For the next 2 hours, Adeline worked with them on the porch, assessing their knowledge and helping them with areas where they struggled. Robert was indeed clever, with a quick mind for mathematics, while his sister Emily showed a talent for reading and composition. Young Michael, at 7, was still mastering the basics, but he was eager to learn. She was so engrossed in the lesson that she didn't notice Ethan's return until his shadow fell across the porch. Looking up, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret: admiration, certainly, but something more complex as well. "You're a natural teacher," he observed. Adeline felt herself blush. "Thank you, they're bright children." "Miss Davis is the best teacher ever," Michael declared. "She doesn't yell when I get my letters backwards." "High praise indeed," Ethan said with a smile. "But we should get you back to town before Mrs. Jenkins sends out a search party." As they prepared to leave, Alice pulled Adeline aside. "You should come again. The children responded well to you, and—" She glanced at Ethan, who was loading the wagon. "It would do him good to have more company than just us and the ranch hands." "I'd like that," Adeline said, surprised to realize how much she meant it. The return journey to town seemed shorter somehow, filled with conversation about the ranch, the children, and Adeline's plans for the school. When they reached the Jenkins house, Ethan jumped down to help her from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist. "Thank you for today," he said, releasing her perhaps a moment later than strictly proper. "Would you be willing to come again? The children would benefit from more of your time before school starts." "I would," Adeline agreed readily. "Perhaps the day after tomorrow." "I'm meeting with Mayor Thompson tomorrow to see the schoolhouse. I'll come for you at 10 if that suits." As she watched him drive away, Adeline felt a curious lightness in her chest. For the first time since leaving Boston, she felt as though she might have found a place where she truly belonged. The next week passed in a whirlwind of activity. Adeline spent her mornings at the schoolhouse, cleaning and organizing the space, taking inventory of supplies, and developing lesson plans. The afternoons she spent at the Fairfield ranch, working with the Patterson children, and occasionally with 2 other children from neighboring ranches who joined the informal lessons. Each day, Ethan would bring her to the ranch and return her to town, their conversations growing increasingly comfortable. She learned about his childhood in Virginia, the son of a shopkeeper who had believed firmly in equality despite living in a slave state. He told her about his dreams for the ranch, the improvements he planned, the legacy he hoped to build. In return, Adeline shared stories of her life in Boston, her parents who had encouraged her education at a time when many still believed women needed only domestic training, her brief teaching career cut short by their deaths, and the subsequent financial difficulties that had led her west. What she didn't tell him was the full truth of why she'd fled Boston, the persistent suitor her parents had named as her guardian. A man 30 years her senior, whose unwanted advances had become increasingly aggressive after their deaths. That shame she kept to herself, afraid it might change how Ethan saw her. On the Saturday before school was to begin, Ethan invited her to stay for dinner at the ranch. "Alice insists," he explained. "She says you've done wonders with the children and deserves a proper thank you." The meal was simple but delicious: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. The conversation flowed easily, with James Patterson sharing stories of cattle drives that had the children laughing and Adeline wide-eyed. After dinner, when the children had been sent to bed, the adults sat on the porch enjoying the cool evening air. "Miss Davis," James said, lighting his pipe, "Ethan tells me you're determined to repay him for buying your contract." Adeline nodded. "It's a matter of principle. I don't want to be beholden to anyone." "Admirable," James agreed, "but there might be a more practical solution than monetary repayment." Ethan shot his foreman a warning look, which the older man cheerfully ignored. "We've been trying to convince this stubborn man to hire a proper housekeeper for years," James continued. "He lives in that big house all alone, eats half his meals with us or in town because he can't be bothered to cook. The place needs a woman's touch." "James," Ethan said, his tone carrying a clear warning. "Not suggesting anything improper," James clarified, grinning at Adeline. "But you could work off your debt by keeping his house in order. A few hours a week would make a world of difference." Adeline looked at Ethan, whose expression was carefully neutral. "Would that be acceptable to you, Mr. Fairfield?" After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "If it's what you want, but I won't have you feeling like a servant again." "There's a world of difference between being forced to serve and choosing to help," Adeline said softly. "I'd be helping a friend, not serving a master." Something flickered in Ethan's eyes at the word friend. Then yes, it would be acceptable, and so a new routine was established. 3 afternoons a week after school, Ethan would bring Adeline to the ranch, where she would spend 2 hours putting his house in order, cleaning, mending, occasionally preparing meals that could be easily reheated. It was an arrangement that raised a few eyebrows in town, but Martha Jenkins, who had appointed herself Adeline's unofficial guardian, deemed it acceptable since Alice was always nearby. What no one could have predicted was how quickly Adeline would transform the ranch house from a merely functional space to a true home. Fresh curtains appeared at the windows, made from fabric ordered from Denver. Wildflowers found their way into jars on the table. Books that had been stacked haphazardly were organized on shelves. And gradually, imperceptibly, Ethan began spending more time in his own house, often sitting at the kitchen table grading over ledgers while Adeline worked nearby. They developed a comfortable companionship, talking easily about books they'd both read, sharing opinions on everything from politics to the proper way to bake bread. Adeline found herself looking forward to these afternoons more than she cared to admit, and she began to notice that Ethan seemed to schedule his work around the ranch to ensure he was home when she was there. As summer turned to fall, the evenings grew cooler, and sometimes they would sit by the fire after she'd finished her work, simply talking until it was time for him to take her back to town. It was during one of these fireside conversations, nearly 2 months after her arrival in Florissant, that Ethan finally asked the question she'd been dreading. "Why did you really leave Boston, Adeline?" he asked, using her first name as he had begun to do in their private conversations. "I know there's more to the story than you've told me." Adeline stared into the flames, gathering her courage. Ethan had shared so much of himself with her, she owed him the truth. "When my parents died," she began slowly, "they left me in the guardianship of a business associate, Mr. Hollister. He was a widower, 55 years old, with grown children. At first, he seemed only concerned with my welfare, helping me secure my teaching position, managing what little money my parents left. She paused, the memory still painful. But then he began to suggest that we should marry. When I refused, he reminded me that as my guardian, he controlled my finances, my housing, even my employment. He became insistent, then demanding. Ethan's jaw tightened. Did he hurt you? Not physically, but his threats became more explicit. He said no one else would want me, that I should be grateful for his interest. She took a shaky breath. One night he came to my room. I managed to lock the door, but I knew I couldn't stay. The next day, I saw the advertisement for teachers needed in the West. It seemed like Providence. So you answered it, not knowing it was a trap, Ethan finished. Adeline nodded. I took what money I could access, barely enough for a train ticket, and fled. The agency promised that my passage would be covered by my future employer. I was desperate enough to believe them. Ethan stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to her, hands clenched at his sides. When he finally turned, his expression was carefully controlled, but his eyes burned with an emotion Adeline couldn't name. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "It explains why you're so determined to be independent, to be no one's property." "Yes," Adeline admitted. "I need to stand on my own, to know that I'm truly free." Ethan crossed the room and knelt before her chair, taking her hands gently in his. "You are free, Adeline. And stronger than anyone I've ever known." The tenderness in his voice undid her. Tears she'd held back for months spilled down her cheeks. Without thinking, she leaned forward, resting her forehead against his shoulder. His arms came around her, hesitant at first, then more confidently as she melted into his embrace. They stayed that way for long minutes, Adeline drawing comfort from his strength, Ethan offering silent support. When she finally pulled back, embarrassed by her display of emotion, she found him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. "I should take you back to town," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "It's getting late." The ride back to Florissant was quiet, both of them lost in thought. When they reached Martha's house, Ethan helped her down from the wagon as usual, but this time he held her hands a moment longer. "Adeline," he began, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words. "Yes," she prompted, heart racing. He cleared his throat. "I want you to know that you're always safe with me. I would never. I'm not like Hollister or Wilcox." Adeline smiled up at him. "I know that, Ethan. I've known it since the day you cut off my chains." He nodded, apparently relieved. "Good night, then." "Good night." As she watched him drive away, Adeline acknowledged what she'd been trying to deny for weeks. She was falling in love with Ethan Fairfield. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. She had come to Colorado determined to be independent, to prove she could stand on her own. How could she reconcile that with her growing feelings for a man who had already rescued her once? October brought the first frost, and with it, a new complication. The town council, pleased with Adeline's work at the school, offered her a permanent contract with a small increase in salary. It was everything she had worked for: security, independence, respect in the community. And yet, when she thought about accepting, about committing to stay in Florissant indefinitely, her thoughts immediately went to Ethan. Their relationship had shifted subtly since the night she'd told him about Hollister. There was a new awareness between them, a current of unspoken feelings that neither seemed ready to acknowledge. Ethan had begun finding reasons to come to town more often, stopping by the school to fix a leaky roof or deliver firewood. Adeline, for her part, had expanded her duties at his house beyond their original agreement, now spending most of Saturday afternoons there, often staying for dinner with the Pattersons. The townsfolk had noticed, of course. Martha Jenkins had taken Adeline aside one evening to advise her gently about propriety and reputation. "People are talking," Martha said. "Not unkindly, mind you. Most folks think it's about time Ethan Fairfield showed interest in a woman, but you're the school teacher, dear. You're held to a higher standard than most." "There's nothing improper between us," Adeline protested, though she felt her cheeks warm. "We're friends." Martha's knowing look said she wasn't fooled. Even so, it might be wise to have a chaperone when you're at the ranch, for appearance's sake. Adeline had agreed, and thereafter Alice Patterson made a point of being visible whenever Adeline was at the ranch house, though she tactfully found reasons to be in another room much of the time. It was on a crisp Saturday in late October when everything changed. Adeline had spent the afternoon at the ranch as usual, preparing a stew for Ethan's Sunday dinner and mending some of his shirts. Alice had gone home early to tend to little Sarah, who had a cold, leaving Adeline to finish up alone a minor breach of propriety that concerned her less than it once would have. She was just putting the last shirt away in Ethan's bedroom when she heard the front door open and close, followed by his voice calling her name. "In here," she replied, stepping quickly into the hallway. "I was just finishing with your mending." Ethan stood in the middle of the living room, still wearing his coat, his hat in his hands. There was something different about him today, a tension, a nervous energy she'd never seen before. "I need to talk to you," he said without preamble. "It's important." Adeline's heart skipped. "Of course." "Is everything all right?" He gestured for her to sit, then remained standing, pacing a few steps before stopping in front of her. "I received a letter today, from an old friend in Denver. He's a lawyer, handles property transactions mostly." Adeline waited, not understanding why this would concern her. He mentioned that he'd been contacted by a man from Boston, looking for information about a missing woman. Ethan watched her face carefully. A woman named Adeline Davis. The blood drained from Adeline's face. "Hollister," she whispered. "He's still looking for me." Ethan nodded grimly. "Apparently so. My friend didn't give him any information, didn't have any to give, but he thought I should know about the inquiry since he knows I live near Florissant. What am I going to do?" Adeline asked, rising to her feet in agitation. "If Hollister finds me, he could force me to return to Boston. He's my legal guardian until I'm 25 or married." "When's your birthday?" Ethan asked. "Not for another 7 months." She pressed a hand to her forehead. "Even if I left Florissant, where would I go? I have no family, no resources except what I've saved from teaching." Ethan took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for something. "There's another solution," he said. "One that would make you legally independent of Hollister or any other guardian." Adeline looked at him questioningly. "Marriage," Ethan said, the word hanging in the air between them. "If you were married, Hollister would have no claim on you." "Are you suggesting I find someone to marry just to escape my guardian?" Adeline asked, her voice rising slightly. "That would be dishonest, not to mention unfair to whatever man agreed to such an arrangement." "Not just anyone," Ethan said quietly. "Me." For a moment, Adeline couldn't speak, couldn't think. Had Ethan Fairfield just proposed to her, and out of pity or obligation rather than love? "Ethan," she began, her voice unsteady, "I appreciate your concern, but I can't let you sacrifice yourself for my problems." "Sacrifice," he repeated, looking genuinely puzzled. Then understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a rueful smile. "Adeline, do you think I'm proposing out of some misguided sense of duty, aren't you?" she challenged. "You've been rescuing me since the day we met." He shook his head, taking a step closer to her. "I'm not explaining this well. The truth is, I've been trying to find the courage to ask you to marry me for weeks now. This letter just forced my hand." Adeline stared at him, scarcely daring to hope. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I love you," Ethan said simply. "I've loved you since that first day when you stood in chains in the middle of town with your chin up and fire in your eyes. I love your strength, your kindness, your determination to make your own way. I love the way you've brought light back into this house, into my life." He took her hands in his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't want to rescue you, Adeline. I want to stand beside you as your equal, your partner in all things, if you'll have me." Tears blurred Adeline's vision. "Oh, Ethan," she whispered, "I love you too. I've been fighting it because I was so afraid of losing myself again, of becoming someone's possession. But you've never treated me that way, never. And I never will," he promised. "You'll always be free to make your own choices. I'm just asking that you choose me." She laughed through her tears. "Yes, yes, I choose you." Ethan's face lit up with a joy she'd never seen before. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, reverent almost, but it held the promise of a passion that made Adeline's heart race. When they finally broke apart, Ethan pressed his forehead to hers. "I should take you back to town," he said reluctantly, "before we completely ruin your reputation." Adeline laughed. "I suppose we should do things properly. We'll need to speak to Reverend Baker about the ceremony." "How soon can we be married?" Ethan asked, his eagerness making her smile. "The banns need to be read for 3 Sundays," she replied. "So 3 weeks at the earliest," Ethan groaned. 3 weeks is an eternity." "We've waited this long," Adeline reminded him. "We can wait a bit longer." The news of their engagement spread through Florissant like wildfire. By Monday morning, every child in Adeline's classroom knew that their teacher was going to marry Mr. Fairfield. And by Monday afternoon, visitors had begun arriving at the schoolhouse with congratulations, and in some cases, barely concealed relief that the town's most eligible bachelor had finally been claimed. Martha Jenkins insisted on hosting a small engagement dinner, inviting the Pattersons, the mayor and his wife, and Reverend Baker. It was during this dinner that the question of where the couple would live after the wedding arose. "Naturally, Adeline will move to the ranch," Ethan said, then glanced at her. "Unless you'd prefer to stay in town during the week, the ride to school would be long every day." Before Adeline could answer, Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. "Actually, that brings up a delicate matter. The school board has a policy about married female teachers." Adeline's heart sank. She'd heard of such policies in other towns. Married women were often expected to give up teaching in favor of domestic duties. "You mean I can't continue teaching after we're married?" The mayor looked uncomfortable. The policy was established years ago when finding teachers was less challenging. It assumes a married woman will have household responsibilities that would interfere with her teaching duties. "That's absurd," Ethan said flatly. "Adeline is an excellent teacher. Marriage won't change that." "I agree," the mayor said, surprising them both. "Which is why I've scheduled a special meeting of the school board next week to reconsider the policy. Times are changing, after all." Adeline felt a rush of gratitude. "Thank you, Mayor Thompson." "Don't thank me yet," he cautioned. "I can't guarantee the outcome, but I believe most of the board members have heard enough praise of your teaching from their children to be persuadable." The school board's decision came 3 days before the wedding. Adeline would be permitted to continue teaching, provided her marriage did not interfere with her duties. It was a significant victory, not just for her but for all future married women who might wish to teach in Florissant. The wedding itself was a simple affair, held in the town's small church on a Sunday afternoon in mid-November. The entire town turned out for the occasion, the church packed to capacity and beyond, with children sitting on the floor near the altar for a better view of their beloved teacher, becoming Mrs. Fairfield. Adeline wore a dress of soft blue silk, ordered specially from Denver, with a crown of late autumn wildflowers in her hair. Ethan, standing tall and proud at the altar in a new black suit, watched her walk down the aisle with an expression of such naked adoration that several older ladies in the congregation were seen dabbing at their eyes. The ceremony was brief, but heartfelt. When Reverend Baker pronounced them man and wife, Ethan kissed Adeline with a restraint that clearly cost him effort, mindful of their audience but unable to completely hide his joy. The celebration afterward, held at the town hall, lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and enough food to feed twice the town's population. As the newly married couple prepared to leave, Martha Jenkins embraced Adeline. "I'm so happy for you, dear," she said warmly. "You've found a good man." "The best," Adeline agreed, her eyes seeking out Ethan, who was saying his goodbyes to the Pattersons. "And he's found a woman worthy of him," Martha added. "You two are well matched, both strong, both kind, both determined to do what's right." As they drove away from the town, Adeline nestled against Ethan's side in the wagon, a sense of profound contentment washing over her. This wasn't at all the life she had imagined when she'd fled Boston, but it was infinitely better than anything she could have dreamed. The ranch house, her new home, had been transformed in preparation for her arrival. Fresh paint, new curtains that Alice had helped hang, a larger bed in what was now their bedroom. But the most touching change was the small room adjacent to the kitchen that Ethan had converted into a study for her, complete with a desk, bookshelves, and a comfortable chair by the window. "This is where you can prepare your lessons," he explained, showing her the space. "Or write, or read, or whatever you want. It's your room to use however you please." Adeline was overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. "It's perfect," she said, unable to express how much it meant to her that he'd created this space that was entirely hers within their shared home. That night, as they lay together in the afterglow of their first intimacy as husband and wife, Ethan traced the fading marks on her wrists where the chains had been. "These are almost gone," he observed. "Yes," Adeline agreed, watching his gentle fingers on her skin. "But I'll never forget them." "Or how you freed me." "You freed yourself," Ethan corrected. "I just helped a little at the beginning." She smiled up at him. "We freed each other, you from your solitude, me from my fears. Partners," he said, kissing her softly. "Equals in all things." "Equals in all things," Adeline repeated, sealing the promise with a kiss of her own. Winter came early that year, blanketing the ranch in snow by early December. Adeline quickly adapted to her new routine, rising before dawn to prepare for the day, riding to town with Ethan when the weather permitted, teaching until mid-afternoon, then returning to the ranch to attend to household matters. It was a busy life, but a fulfilling one. Christmas was a particularly joyous occasion, with the Pattersons and several of the ranch hands joining them for a feast in the main house. Adeline had decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, and a small tree stood in the corner of the living room, adorned with paper ornaments her students had made. As they prepared for bed that night, Adeline handed Ethan a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Merry Christmas," she said, suddenly shy. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a leather-bound journal with his initials tooled into the cover. "It's beautiful," he said, running his fingers over the fine craftsmanship. "Thank you. Open it," Adeline urged. Inside, on the first page, she had written, "For my husband, to record our story as it unfolds. May these pages hold our joys, our challenges, and all the moments in between." Ethan looked up at her, his eyes suspiciously bright. "Our story," he repeated. "I like the sound of that." "I have a feeling it's going to be a good one," Adeline said, taking his hand and placing it gently on her stomach. "Especially with the new chapter we'll be starting in about 7 months." For a moment, Ethan didn't seem to comprehend her meaning. Then his eyes widened. We're. Adeline nodded, laughing at his stunned expression. "Yes, we're going to have a baby." The joy that transformed his face was beyond description. He gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." As they held each other in the quiet of their bedroom, the wind howling outside and the fire crackling in the hearth, Adeline reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her here. From chains to freedom, from solitude to love, from fear to joy, it had been a path neither of them could have predicted, but one that had led them exactly where they were meant to be. In the years that followed, Adeline and Ethan built a life rich with purpose and love. Their first child, a son they named William, arrived in the summer of 1876, followed 2 years later by a daughter, Elizabeth. Adeline continued teaching until shortly before Elizabeth's birth, then took a year away before returning to the classroom. By then, Florissant had grown enough to need 2 teachers, and the school board was only too happy to have Mrs. Fairfield back, even on a part-time basis. The Fairfield ranch prospered under Ethan's careful management, eventually becoming one of the largest cattle operations in the county. But his greatest pride was always his family, his strong, independent wife, and their growing children. Together, they created a home where equality wasn't just a principle but a lived reality, where chains of any kind were unthinkable, and where love was the foundation of every decision. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Ethan would take Adeline's hands in his thumbs brushing over her wrists where the shackles had once been, and they would remember how their story began with chains broken and freedom given, with respect offered and equality claimed. It wasn't always an easy life. The West remained a challenging place, with harsh winters, uncertain markets for their cattle, and the occasional dispute with neighboring ranchers. But it was a life they had chosen together, as partners, as equals. And neither would have traded it for anything in the world. By 1885, 10 years after Adeline had first arrived in Florissant in chains, the Fairfield Ranch had become a cornerstone of the community. Their home was frequently filled with visitors, students past and present, neighboring ranchers, townspeople who had become dear friends. Their third child, another son named James after Ethan's loyal foreman, had joined the family in 1881, completing their brood. On the anniversary of the day they had met, a date neither of them would ever forget, Ethan surprised Adeline with a special gift. It was a small silver locket, and inside was a tiny key. "What's this?" she asked, turning the delicate key in her fingers. "It's the key to your shackles," Ethan explained. "I kept it all these years as a reminder of what might never have been if I hadn't been in town that day." Tears filled Adeline's eyes as she closed the locket, pressing it against her heart. "The best day of my life," she whispered. "The day my true freedom began." Ethan drew her into his arms, holding her close. "Mine too," he said. "The day I found my equal, my partner, my heart." And so their story continued, built on a foundation of respect and love that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances, with a woman in chains, and a man who saw beyond them to the strength and dignity within. In Florissant, Colorado, their legacy would endure for generations, not just in the ranch that bore their name, or the school where Adeline taught until her retirement, but in the example they set of true partnership, of equality freely given and joyfully received, of chains broken and never reforged. For Adeline and Ethan Fairfield had discovered what many seek but few truly find: the freedom that comes only when two people stand together, not as master and servant, not as rescuer and rescued, but as equals joined in love, facing life's journey side by side.